You flyover state folks are laughing at us now and saying, "Okay, coastal people, where's your apples now?" The CHIPS Act and clean water, we have it made. But as with so many things, we are all connected. And this idea of sea level rise, this one fraction of the climate crisis that doesn't account for climate migration, food insecurity, or reshaping of our coastlines threatens your daily life just through the loss of working ports like ours alone. It only takes one tanker bumping into a bridge in Baltimore to demonstrate how important these coastal systems are. By the way, did anyone see some memes about that? We had a similar issue in Portsmouth, and one of them was, "Go home, boat, you're drunk," which I thought was a good one. Luckily here at New Deal, we got you. We have your back and are digesting some of these really big issues into digestible pieces that you can tackle, because it can be an overwhelming problem. Today, we're going to try to highlight some of the solutions and resources designed for state and local policymakers like you, and try very hard to make them something you can understand and act on. Don't forget, you are not in it alone and wondering what you can do. There's a lot of smart people across the country that are working very hard to make this something that can be dropped into the wheels of local and state government. So let me highlight a few things we've already covered in our climate policy working group, just so that you guys know the resources are there. We have a guide to leveraging federal funding, which has a list of resources like the Milken Institute's Community Infrastructure Center platform. We have the Electrification Coalition's Guide to Federal Funding and the DOE Loan Programs Office Guide. We have model policies for state and local officials that are highlighted in our report. And we also have webinars available on carbon dioxide removal, which is a topic we'll cover in more depth today. EVs, which have about $5 billion available from the bipartisan infrastructure law. Renewable generation, which accommodates beneficial electrification joining the grid by starting with grid modernization, our highway of electrons. And workforce transition, so the domestic content provisions of the Inflation Reduction Act, bringing jobs home and putting domestic content inside of our renewables. So I'm so grateful you guys are all here today. Please know each little victory will represent countless hours of work, but it's work that we must do. I have 3 little daughters that are counting on you. So with that, let me turn to our panelists who have already been introduced, and I'm going to let them get us started. Yeah, well, thank you guys so much for being here. I know your bios have already been read, so I don't have to do that part, but Sam, if you wouldn't mind, I would love to have you start.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much. I'm Sam Singh, a state senator over in Michigan, and I always like to tell the story about how we've progressed. In 2016, we did an energy rewrite. At that point in time, we had a Republican governor, a Republican House, and a Republican Senate. We had a very modest renewable energy standard at 5%, and the person who introduced the Republican bills actually tried to remove that standard completely. So that's where we started off in 2016. Now, in 2016, I was the lead Democratic negotiator on those bills because of some quirks of the Republican majority. They needed Democratic votes in the end. And so we got a very small, modest increase in our renewable energy standard to 15%. We created an energy efficiency standard that required all of our utilities to spend at least 1% of their annual sales on energy efficiency programs for residents and businesses. And so that was very modest, but it was all done in a Republican-controlled environment. Fast forward in 2018, Michigan elects Governor Gretchen Whitmer. She starts moving on climate, focusing on executive orders and executive directives. And then fast forward to 2022, for the first time in over 40 years, Michigan wins the state Senate and the state House for Democrats, and we have a trifecta. So I knew that I wanted to be involved with the energy policies to do something bold, which we weren't able to do in 2016. And so I was really pleased to have some great partners, my colleagues in the Senate, and we pushed forward a set of bills that focused on creating a 100% clean energy standard by 2040, with interim goals at 2030 and 2035 of having at least 50% renewable by 2030 and 60% renewable by 2035. The rest of that clean includes things like nuclear and other types of sources that you find in these clean energy standards all across the country. So what was unique in this space is we only have a one-seat majority in the House and the Senate, and you can imagine the Democratic constituencies that come together make finding something as bold as climate change policy difficult. So we had to form a coalition that attracted labor, environmental groups, and those that are focused on environmental justice, and bring all those together, and at the same time be able to move the business side of the sector, whether those were our utilities or our energy companies that did community solar and all those things, also keep them in the tent without losing them as well. And so we were able to get a number of great things done by the end of the year. For equity, we actually required that our energy efficiency programs get increased to, at a minimum, 1.5% of annual sales. For the first time ever, there was a minimum low-income spend by all the utilities that they were required to spend at least a quarter of those dollars in low-income communities. We changed what our Public Service Commission could regulate. Now they can take into account climate, health considerations, the history of a community, and their energy burden. And so now we have environmental justice communities that can actually have a voice with our Public Service Commission as they're regulating the utilities that they oversee. And then the last piece that we pulled everything together was a reform on siting that allowed for some local control, but then also created state-level standards so we could ensure that we were getting the renewable build-out that we wanted. And then we wanted to ensure that labor was a critical part of the component, and so we created a Just Transition Office. We mirrored it off of what's in Illinois and in Colorado, but we required that this office not only took a look at energy sector transitions to make sure those workers actually got either upskilled to new opportunities or were given skills to go to a different industry, but we also did that in the manufacturing space. Obviously, Michigan being a manufacturing community with the big three and other automobile industries, we wanted to ensure the EV transition was also taken care of. And so we're the only state now that has a Just Transition Office that also looks at manufacturing. And we left the door open for us to be also take a look at AI and other types of transitions. So as workers are being transitioned out of jobs, that we at least have resources that we can dedicate for the upskilling of those individuals. So, the last weeks of October and November, as our session came to an end, we were able to finalize the last components of that. And I would say, taking a lot from places like Minnesota and Illinois, we now have one of the more bolder strategies for a Midwest, especially in the Rust Belt, taking all those good ideas and then putting a Michigan spin on it. And I know we'll get into some more additional details as we have this conversation, but it was something when you take a look at starting off in 2016 when the idea was to repeal these standards, and now in 2024, now that the law is in effect, we're now moving towards 100% clean for the state of Michigan.
Impressive stuff. I'm looking forward to digging into some of the details there. All right, Jennifer, would you like to start off with introducing us to your work?
I'd be happy to. I think I'm going to have some slides that will pop up in a second here. And until they do, I'll just go ahead. I'm a scientist at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. It's one of our Department of Energy laboratories. And I just led a big team of folks, 70 individuals across the country, writing a report that we call Roads to Removal. And it's focused on carbon dioxide removal, which is the next step after everything we just heard about. So this report is got really, really high-level, high-resolution data. At every county, we have an estimate of how and how much it will cost to remove CO2 from the atmosphere. So what the opportunities are for each of you and your constituents. So let me give you a little précis on what is carbon dioxide removal. Because the big elephant in the room we just heard about, it's decarbonization or switching to renewables and stopping the emissions of carbon dioxide, of methane, of nitrous oxide. But even if we get all the way there on decarbonizing our economy, there are still some parts, the airplane I flew on to get here, it's really difficult to make sustainable airline fuel that doesn't rely on a fossil fuel product. So we will unlikely get all the way to zero when we need to be able to limit warming in our atmosphere. So we need to literally remove CO2 from our atmosphere. That's the removal part, by either vacuuming it out with machines, that's pretty expensive, or using plants, which have done it for millennia, photosynthesis. And I'll tell you just a little bit about the approaches, but our goal is to remove something on the order of 1 billion tons per year by the time we get to 2050. There are lots of ways to do that. We're just in our report looking at the things that are available that are mature right now. Everything from managing our forests better and using the waste that we take out of forests, ways that we can manage our agriculture using cover cropping and more perennials on marginal lands, ways that we can take all of that accumulated material, that organic waste that you probably put in your green bin if you've got one, or is burned, or is sometimes just left to decompose on the land, collecting that material, and instead of paying to send it to a landfill, taking it to a biorefinery instead, making hydrogen, making sustainable airline fuel, making bio-oil that could be used for asphalt. All of those products offset the cost of transporting that material. And while we're making those products, we capture CO2 and we then inject that deep within the ground, essentially permanent storage in geologic reservoirs. And then finally, we can use direct air capture. You may have heard of that concept. There's some new funding coming out of the federal government that supports direct air capture and injection in deep reservoirs. That's great. We have lots of opportunity to do that, but it is expensive. So what our report shows, this is just the big take-home message, is absolutely yes, we can achieve 1 billion tons of removals by 2050. We can do that in many, many different ways across the country, and our report shows, again, for each county, what the options are and what the costs are. The overall cost number is $129 billion. I know that sounds like a big number, but I challenge you to think about what other commodity you can pay $130 a ton. Maybe sand, not much. And I also understand that what we're talking about here is waste removable for an invisible kind of garbage. That can be difficult to communicate to the public. But I want to encourage you to, again, to look at this report and look at some of the details, the jobs that can be created, the new industries that are largely in regions that are losing fossil energy jobs are really substantial. And I'll end just with this figure. There are lots of beautiful figures in this report. And if you can remember roads2removal.org, you can go and see lots of short videos. You could download all 500 pages. You can look at the executive summary. But what these maps show are that in each region of the country, we have different opportunities. In New Hampshire, it's going to be about forest management and moving waste away from those centers of forestry and using it productively. In Michigan, where it's going to be about growing energy crops on some marginal lands. Here in the Southwest and the Intermountain West, it might be about doing direct air capture, using renewable energy to fuel that process. So I'm excited to answer specifics as we have dinner together and talk more about what is the opportunities in your specific region. But what I want you to take away is really that there's an enormous opportunity both to create jobs and to create new industries while we're literally removing CO2 from our atmosphere.
Wow, impressive. This is this whole concept of this carbon dioxide removal is fascinating. You guys should really go watch the webinar. I know, in your free time. All right, and then Nicole, I think you're here to talk to us a little bit about procurement, but I'll turn it over to you to sort of tell us about your work.
Procurement. That's an exciting topic, right? I think so. I'm hoping I'm going to sell it to you as one of the most viable, important climate solutions available within state and local government. So I'm Nicole Darnall. I am director of Arizona State University's Sustainable Procurement Research Initiative, where we're producing actionable research to help organizations think about how they embed sustainability into procurement decisions. We've studied more than 4,000 local governments globally to arrive at high-level observations about what's making this succeed and where organizations stumble. I also serve as commissioner to the General Services Administration's Federal Advisory Committee that's helping them embed sustainability into the procurement process. So what does this mean? We're talking about embedding social and environmental criteria into the procurement process. This can be done by a standalone policy, but it could also be done less formally through an existing policy. Perhaps your local government has a climate action plan, and procurement becomes one of the mechanisms then to leverage within that space. And you might ask, well, what's the big deal? Why is this important? Well, if we think about US GDP, between 1 in every 4 and 1 in every $5 in the US economy is tied to a government worker's decision to procure something. This is a huge amount of money in our economy. State and local governments account for more than half of that spend. So there's enormous leverage that exists to change supply chains globally, and in places that have far weaker environmental regulations than what we have here. So the spillover benefits are enormous. Taking this now to the opportunity space of state and local government, climate emissions, so we tend to focus when we think about climate neutrality on Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. Procurement emissions are the bulk of Scope 3 emissions. These are the indirect emissions that are so thorny and difficult to wrap our hands around. So by virtue of pivoting our purchasing decisions, we can get a handle on Scope 3 emissions. They account for more than 80% of your organization's total climate emissions. I'm going to say that again. Procurement accounts for more than 80% of your organization's total climate emissions. So if you're serious about climate change, you must consider what's happening with your procurement spend. So that's on the environment side. But now let's talk a little bit about the social and justice component. So my statistic here is women and minority-owned businesses. At the federal level, they receive 15% of federal contracts, 15%, but they account for more than 40% of the eligible businesses. So we're dealing with enormous structural barriers that is creating access to a broader swath of suppliers to our organizations. And then finally, and I'll end on this, climate technologies are fantastic. We have a slew that are coming forward, many, many different ways in which we can manage climate change through technology. It's only going to be effective if those technologies are procured.
All right, there is some big stuff to dive into here. I'm gonna start a little bit broad, and then we'll get into some of the specifics here. But I think we all hear this urgency, right? This is a climate crisis. You guys have, some of you devoted your lives and your careers to this. But the bills are big, right? The Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, CHIPS Act, the Inflation Reduction Act. What's one takeaway that you guys can highlight for our leaders that they can understand about their role? Are there specific barriers that you feel like need to be overcome, or is there a way that we can sort of help our leaders take the first step into some of the really complex technology you guys are talking about?
Well, I will say that anytime you work on complicated policy, there's always this group of people within a legislature or a council who always says, well, we can probably do this next year. because this is too complicated to get it done in 1 year. Last policy in energy in Michigan took 2 years to try to get done. We're trying now to get it done in 7 months. But what ended up happening is the federal opportunity was too great in Washington, D.C. for us not to take action this year in Michigan. And because we didn't want to leave any of those dollars that could help us with the climate change process that we wanted to have in Michigan, we're going to subsidize, instead of our customers, whether it's a resident or a business, paying a utility to make this thing, we now have all these federal dollars that can come to our utilities, that come to our communities, that actually help us make that bridge. And so for us in Michigan, the reason to get everything done in a very shortened period of time was because of these dollars that were available. And until there was actually analysis done by outside groups to show legislators what the opportunity was, we were at a stalemate. And once people saw that opportunity and how many billions of dollars that we could potentially lose, that was a game changer for us. And so I think for city councils, county commissions, wherever, I think having a full understanding of what those opportunities are and how to leverage those. I know communities are doing great work. I know we've had some conversations here amongst New Deal leaders in past events where how do you leverage those dollars? But there is an immense amount of resources to help us make these transitions. And if we don't do it now, I think we're not only going to hurt the climate crisis as a whole, but we're not going to get another opportunity like this in the future with tax dollars if we don't do this right this first time around.
That's great. Yeah, Jennifer?
Yeah, I'll echo that in saying that it is really critical to get it right this first time. And there are things amongst what I described that we can do now, and there are things that are going to take significant policy and capital investment that are really 10, 20 years out. But in the near term, the solutions that I talked about that can be practiced in terms of agriculture and in forestry are completely understood by the growers and by those foresters. They know how this works, and the costs are in the tens of dollars. They're not $200 a ton for CO2 removal. So we do need policy that incentivizes those approaches that folks know how to put into place. And we do need to reduce the barriers to public understanding of that value. And one of the biggest things that I think federally and yet at a state level could be incentivized is coming up with standards. We call it measurement, reporting, and verification, so that folks understand that CO2 removed via forest in New Hampshire is equivalent to CO2 removed by a direct air capture plant in Wyoming. That CO2 coming out of the atmosphere benefits the climate system. The way it happened was very, very different. But we need to be able to level that playing field, and that some of the investment that the federal government has put in is trying to establish that kind of system. But locally, again, I want to refer you back to the report to look at individual counties and what their opportunities are, because there's an enormous amount of investment in new industry. I talk to startups all the time that are super excited about this space, but helping get those folks across that, what we call the science of scale up, moving from the single facility to many, many facilities, moving from a single injection well to many, many, establishing primacy over the ability to do CO2 injection into the ground, working with those energy companies that know that technology. Those are the things that I think very locally are really quite tangible.
Very interesting. I'm gonna come back to that. I have a question for you, but Nicole, why don't you address that?
I'll hop in quickly. Within the procurement space, one of the key recipes to success here is helping foster an innovation culture. And public organizations in general tend to be more risk averse than what we see in the private sector. Procurement professionals are even more risk averse, right? But all good ideas, before they soar, they stumble. And individuals within these organizations need to have some assurance that if they stumble, if they experiment and stumble, that they recognize that's part of the learning process. We learn through our failures. And so within procurement departments, they need an understanding that experimentation is part of what is expected of them in order to reach this new place, this new way of working that hasn't really existed until today. So we need to give them permission to lean in and to stumble.
All right, great. So let's get a little more specific here. I want to bring these policies, down to a level that really feels tangible to our leaders. So, Nicole, let's just continue with what you were just talking about. So you're mentioning innovation. I was wondering if you could give us an example. You mentioned this powerful statistic that 80% of our emissions from our organizations are from our procurement decisions. Could you give us an example of a procurement that occurs, normally at the state or even municipal level, sort of a routine procurement where we could realize some real emissions reductions that our leaders could sort of think about enacting?
Yeah. So as I've worked with different cities, there are different ways to approach this. You could look at the real high impact items first, but oftentimes we're talking about changing an organization culture. So we should be thinking about items that connect with every department within the organization, right? And so I oftentimes encourage organizations to think about cleaning products as one of those low-hanging fruit items. We have more information about these products on the market in order for individuals within procurement to feel like they're making a still risky, but less risky decision. Within City of Phoenix, we worked with them as they were developing competitions then, so they implemented their sustainable procurement policy. They chose to focus on office products, another one of those routine purchases that connect with every department across the organization. If you want to change the culture, you should be thinking about these products. And they implemented competitions across the different departments in order to make this fun and lively and gain recognition and gain momentum. And then they had a very, very ugly trophy that came with the honor of winning that competition. And that trophy is getting passed around to the different departments. And on one hand, we might say this seems like a low bar approach, but organizations have to start somewhere, and this is a really good place to begin.
I have visions of a toilet maybe involved in this trophy. Okay, that's a great example. So, and then Jennifer, I guess, again, trying to get a little more specific, one of your numbers up on one of your slides caught my eye. It's at $129 per ton of CO2 removal. So I know I've served at the municipal level. When we talk about sort of paying for these solutions, we have to go face our voters, with the increase to our budget or our tax rate or cents on the dollar. So are these economic solutions that can be enacted locally, or are they more state level solutions when you talk about something like forestation or practices?
I believe it really happens both at the local level and the state level. And it is more likely to happen at that local level because that's where an individual company would be, or a landowner that's controlling either forest land or agricultural land. So let me be clear that $130 a ton number is an average across all the different techniques we looked at to get to 1 billion tons. There's actually a good 100, 200 million tons of removals possible at $10, $20, $30. Really, in many of those cases, the co-benefits that come with applying the practice outweigh the monetary cost. So, for example, when you put a cover crop on an agricultural field in the wintertime, it prevents erosion, it holds water better, you get a better microbiome in the soil. There are all sorts of things that come along with keeping that carbon in the ground. And all of those we don't have a great way to monetize, but they're worth something, and a farmer will tell you they understand that. I had a group of growers out visiting with us recently, and they know that for sure. So I think that the opportunities are almost always local with individual businesses. I was just down in Bakersfield, California, which is an area that's long been extracting fossil energy products from the ground. But those businesses are the ones that see, honestly, very clearly that they need to transition to injecting carbon in the ground instead of extracting it. And they are also very cognizant that they need to work with local community and environmental justice organizations to come to a consensus about how to do this safely and in a way that cleans up the air and cleans up, to be honest, past wrongs and who benefited. And so I really think that the local and state level is where it's going to happen.
Interesting. So you could have, for example, a program that subsidized or provided seeds for a cover crop if you were in a certain area.
Yeah, interestingly enough, across the country, 6% of our row crops have a cover crop on. But in Maryland, where they pay, I think it's about $20 an acre incentive, 86% of the land is in cover crops. So it's a subtle, I mean, well, you may think that's a lot, but I see that as, compared to some of the other subsidies in our ag sector, it's a subtle change that makes a big change in practices.
Okay, that's a great example. All right, and so Sam, one of the things you mentioned in your intro was really interesting to me. You used the word upskilling. So I know you were talking about workforce transition, and you have this really interesting piece of legislation. I think they're the same piece of legislation that created the Just Transition Office. So I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about what does that mean in a day-to-day operation? Like, what does this Just Transition Office do, and how do you sort of measure your success in this upskilling work?
Well, I think we're kind of building the model just as other states. As I mentioned, Illinois and Colorado were two places that had started these Just Transition offices, but they're only in the couple years in existence. So I think they're still trying to get a sense of what the metrics will be for success. But I think our hope is, we all get billions of dollars of federal workforce dollars that come through our state. In Michigan, we typically wait for the crisis as we deploy new dollars out for training. And so, back in 2008, 2009, we took a whole bunch of, federal dollars, asked for a waiver, and started, paying people to get training because they've lost their jobs. And what we're saying here is, let's do that training and use those dollars before they lose their jobs. And if we know someone's gonna, let's say a coal plant's gonna shut down by 2032, and certain people are gonna lose their jobs, let's make sure that there's a set of financial resources that are geared towards that utility and those workers to be able to then help them get whatever skills they need to make a transition. Now, some transitions can still happen within the utility itself. They could go to other types of plants. They could, go towards, learning how to do solar installations, storage installations, and things like that. In Michigan, at least in the Midwest, we saw some of our largest growth in green energy jobs. And so there could be transition away from maybe the large utility to one of those companies and so forth. So to us, we want to be able to reutilize our federal dollars and our state dollars that go to workforce training to do that on a proactive measure versus waiting for somebody to potentially lose their job and then give them the resources that they need. And so this will be a partnership that will be done with business and workers together, but we want to do it on the front end of the equation because we know that transitions are happening. We know that certain dates these companies have to be done with coal. They have to have so much, renewable by these dates, and so we want to make sure that there's the workforce that's going to be ready and able to do all the things that the legislation required.
Yeah, it's super interesting. And so, is that who's doing the training as that rolls out? Is that a partnership with your community college? Are folks coming into the utility employees and sort of doing in-house trainings, or how is it working out?
I think it'll be a combination. It's the offices in our Department of Labor and Economic Opportunity. That's where our federal workforce and state workforce dollars go. That's where our partnerships with our community colleges and their workforce training. We have what we call Michigan Works, which are our local county-based workforce development boards. So all those pieces are within that department. Now this new kind of Just Transition Office is going to coordinate those activities. So some of that activity could be done by community colleges. I'm sure they would probably bid out certain types of training. In other instances, if the utility knew what skills that they needed for employees to make a transition within the company, they could either partner with, private industry or the workforce system itself. And so I think there is not one model, but I think there will be multiple models, and having all those within the same department allows that agency now to be able to look at how to implement training in a different way, but in a proactive way as those transitions are going to be made.
Super interesting. I know I mentioned to you guys I work in renewables, and I negotiated a deal once in Ohio, and one of the utilities we were working with, they knew they were going to have to retire some of their coal plants like years down the road, and so they were shifting their workforce from coal to new wind farms out in the Midwest. So it's just an example of, I'm sure that the support is really appreciated. So just to go back to a little more general question, two of you actually mentioned that you implemented policies where climate was sort of used as a criteria making decision. I know, Sam, you mentioned at the PSC, you kind of, or PUC, I'm not sure if you said PSC or PUC, that, climate could sort of become a consideration for, their sort of adjudicatory decisions. And then I believe it was Nicole, you mentioned instituting climate as sort of a criteria for procurement, either as a standalone policy or on an informal basis. So I wondered if you guys could speak in a little more detail, like maybe give an example if you have one of a place where that climate being a criteria made a difference in a decision, if there is one that you can think of.
Well, in the Michigan model, that law is obviously just coming into effect. We passed it in November, and it's going into effect. So when the utilities have to go through their integrated resource planning process, that has to go in front of, we call it Public Service Commission, but other people call it PUCs, depending on your state, that the commission itself, as adjudicate the IRP process, they can look at climate, they can look at health concerns. So if there's asthma impacts based off of the carbon output, they can take a look at health considerations. So there was a variety of affordability as part of that, environmental justice, being able to take a look at past sort of engagement. Those were things that our commission told us that they didn't feel they had the legal authority to do. And so that's why we wanted to change the law to allow them to be able to incorporate those items into their process. We'll see, the IRP process. I think one of our next utilities will be going through that here at the end of 24 into 25. And I think I'll be able to answer that question once that actually has been implemented. But we wanted to give the tools because they had told us that they didn't have the legal authority to take in health considerations, for example, when they were approving whether it was a natural gas plant or other types of facilities. Yeah, that's great. And in some cases, just so that we break down what IRP is for those of you that are still listening, in some cases it's sort of, you can think of it as almost like a look forward. There's some capital improvement plan aspects to it. So how are we going to invest in sort of the infrastructure that generates and transmits our electricity? And you wouldn't contemplate having a state highway system that didn't have sort of a capital improvement program to it. And so I think moving into this utility space and sort of addressing, which costs are recoverable and how the utilities can kind of plan for this future is an important thing you can do as state lawmakers with a relatively simple piece of legislation in some cases. So that's great. I want to continue to focus on ways that we can sort of bring these pieces back to the state and local level. So I think, I want to talk about this carbon dioxide removal piece a little bit more because I know sometimes when we see sort of like a big structure with a bunch of fans in it to sort of work on carbon dioxide removal, I think some of us might think like, I can't even get bridges replaced. How am I going to get this big fan structure thing built? Can you just talk a little bit about, have you seen funding models on pilot projects, for example, that could sort of allow our leaders to contemplate how to build this into their budget? Because I know you also talked about scaling, like don't just build one big fan structure, build 20 of them. So how do we sort of get over the dollar sign piece, or what have you seen work?
Yeah. Well, first I want to just reemphasize that we have costs already that we're not internalizing into the conversation. We pay, the CDC thinks something like 5% of our gross domestic product is the cost of the air pollution and water pollution caused by our current fossil fuel and artificial fertilizer use. So that cost is happening now. Something like $93 billion is the cost just in the last couple of years of climate change disasters. right? Those are true actual costs. So we need to think about those offsetting what we actually pay out of pocket for something like carbon removal or decarbonization. But that said, an individual company has got to get that start. And let me first say that while I know the fans sucking CO2 out of they're sort of like the charismatic showpiece, and I know that DOE's just invested billions of dollars in literally a couple of those, that's not where I would start, because that's off in the future. I would start local with your foresters, where in the Pacific Northwest and even down here in Arizona, we've got huge fire risk because our forests have literally too many trees. We need to decarbonize those forests by pulling waste and extra forest biomass out. In doing so, we reduce the risk of fire, the loss of jobs and lives and homes, and the air pollution that results because of those fires. And then that biomass, that material, is material that we can use to make useful products. We could burn it and just make electrons, but why don't we value the carbon instead and make sustainable airline fuel, make hydrogen, make the biogas, bio-oil, biochar? I could get real geeky on you here, but there are a lot of different processes. So those commodities have a value in the marketplace, and producing those in a biorefinery, many of which we already have the understanding scientifically of, offsets the cost. So yes, a company's got to be willing to step up and say, I'm willing to take the risk to get the loans for the capital investment. But I've seen more and more of those companies stepping up. What they could use from folks like yourselves is the partner with, where do I get my biomass from? Is it an agricultural field? Is it a municipality that's got a lot of organic waste they need to get rid of and not pay to send to a landfill? And then on the backside, they need to be connected to an injection point where they actually store carbon either below ground or in some durable material like asphalt. So connecting those different parties is something I really see policymakers having a lot of leverage in.
Yes, reminding us that one of our roles is as convener. That's great. Okay, are we awake? How we doing? We're here? All right, I like it. This is important stuff. It's nerdy though, I get it. What questions do we have out there? Are there some things we can answer? Yes, ma'am.
Hi, Andrea McCollum, City of Norfolk. We got a mic coming to you, Andrea. What's that? We got a mic coming to you for the live stream.
Hey, Andrea McClellan, City of Norfolk. Like Rebecca, I live in an area that's flooded a lot, and we recognize the value of trees and the multi-benefits of trees from erosion, water quality, et cetera. One of the things that I think we as policymakers sometimes forget is we get geeky and nerdy and all this stuff, is to remember the communities in which we're putting these trees, explaining why they're important. And as Mayor Bibb said earlier today, really understanding why climate was important to some of these communities who have no idea why we're planting trees. We did a project in Norfolk, a massive flooding project, and we had to put trees in some of our underserved communities. Those neighbors actually came in and pulled them all out.
Yeah.
They felt like it was being done to them and not being done with them. So I think it's really important that we think about the social equity piece and the environmental equity piece, because oftentimes as policymakers, we forget that human element. It is a change, and we know it's gonna reduce their heat island effect. We know it's gonna improve their water quality. We know it's gonna improve their air quality. They don't see that because it's not part of their daily lives. And so we have to make sure, so I don't know if you have any thing that you've experienced this, but it was really a shock for really well-intentioned environmental stewards in our community who were absolutely gobsmacked that what they thought was good was then actually considered something very, very negative. It was more of a comment, sorry.
I just want to support that 100%. We devoted a huge chunk of our analysis to the environmental equity and justice perspective, who wins and who loses, both in terms of people, the environment. And what we're finding our biggest job is actually at the National Lab. Of course, we're continuing to do the science, but communicating and enabling those conversations. And enabling them in ways where we're not explaining the second thought of thermodynamics to people. That doesn't help. We really need to help folks come together and speak common language. I'm very excited that the Department of Energy has included a new mandate that there's always a community benefits plan in any of these big new projects that they're funding. But folks don't know how to write a community benefits plan. The community wants benefits, but they don't know what to ask for. So it's almost like extension agents from our agricultural colleges that go out to growers and help them understand what's needed. We need a kind of an industry that helps community and industry and policymakers come together. I agree.
That's great. Do you guys want to respond, or you? No.
I'll jump
Yes,
in.
good.
I mean, this is a job for School of Sustainability students as well. I have the fantastic opportunity to work with some pretty amazing individuals who want to become the next generation of solutioneers. And schools such as my own are looking for hands-on projects to broker these focus groups, to get communities engaged, to get their hands dirty and learn along the way. So you shouldn't feel like you're doing this on your own, that institutions such as my own are actively curating these projects and these opportunities for our students. Come to us. We'll sort something out.
That is great to know. Okay, what other questions can we answer out there? Yay, yes.
It's more of a suggestion. Sarah's slide of $129 billion that's needed. There is the federal farm bill is being discussed right now, and there's $20 billion in climate smart agriculture, which is coming back to your districts for farmers to do these kind of projects. It needs help. It needs all the Democrats in Congress to stand firm on that $20 billion and hopefully convince some of the Republican members that this is really important for the district too. So I know you're all state and local, but you have some ability to influence your federal delegation, and that is $20 billion towards this type of work that Sarah was talking about.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, the federal dollars are there, but then even in Michigan, we put it in our own budget, in our ag budget, a smaller amount for Michigan, and I would say every state should be looking at putting in their own resources, then to obviously then help pull down the federal dollars that are there as well. But these best practices for farming can be really important for the long-term nature. You were talking about sustainable aviation fuel. In Michigan, we're, Detroit's a hub for Delta, and so we're trying to take a look at how we take a look at incentivizing sustainable aviation fuel, because up to 80% of carbon emissions could be reduced from airplanes if you do this right. And so as part of that conversation, we're taking a look at what are the best practices for the ag products that we're going to be using. We're going to use more corn and soybean in ours, but we want to make sure that it's at the highest level of farming, and so there's incentives within the bill for those farmers to have stronger provisions within their own practices to make sure that it's sustainable long term.
Super interesting. Thank you so much for the comment. Yes, question over here.
Yeah, Jennifer, you had mentioned that the cost of the carbonization is embedded into what we pay today, but the cost of decarbonization requires actual cash out the door to build those big fans that you're talking about. And you also noted that dozens of startups that are looking at this industry, the circular economy and how that works. But where is the money, the revenue that becomes available to let these startups earn a return on their investment? Where do we see that coming from?
Yeah. Well, again, that's why I want to re-emphasize that the near-term opportunities are not in the director capture fans. I know we get a lot of photos of those, and they're fun to think about the science, but the near-term opportunities are plants taking CO2 out of the atmosphere, actual green plants. And it's in our agricultural fields. I've talked to folks in Nebraska all the way to Michigan, to Virginia, who love what is in the new Climate Smart Ag Bill and know that there have been perverse incentives for a long time, and not just affecting carbon dioxide, but nitrous oxide because of nitrogen fertilizers, which put nitrates in our water and other negative effects. But before we get to those fans, the direct air capture, we can spend something like $80 a ton to convert biomass. And that's why I keep wanting to talk about using biomass that we draw from agriculture, from forestry, purpose-grown crops, or even our municipalities that have a lot of organic waste that, again, we literally truck to a landfill. If we value that material and take it to a biorefinery instead, that biorefinery can produce any number of products that have a valuable, saleable product. And that is what helps make the economics of that facility work. Now, it still has an inherent cost at the end of the day, but we do have federal incentives. You might be aware of the 45Q credit. This is, it's upwards of $120 a ton right now to inject CO2 below ground. That won't exist forever. I hope it doesn't. I hope that it becomes a self-sustaining model. But right now, there is money to be made if you can find the initial investment to build the refinery. There are products to be made, and there's a return on investment for storing carbon.
Yeah, it strikes me too that there's a message for some of our more rural places in all of this too, which is that, you know, some of these really complex problems come back to some really old-fashioned sustainable practices that, you know, that our citizens will kind of be happy to hear. Does that answer your question? Somewhat? Yeah, okay. I think, are we about at the end? All right, well, I would like to thank our panel. This has been a great discussion. I think you guys have been very concrete, and thank you to our audience.
All right, thank you folks for an amazing, productive day one. We covered so much ground, and I'm looking forward to doing it all over again tomorrow. Reminder that folks that are joining us at dinner, buses will be leaving from just outside of these doors at 6 o'clock, so please join us 5 to 10 minutes beforehand so we can start loading the buses.